this session. As artificial intelligence accelerates, it will continue to redefine how nations think about many things, like productivity and policy and regulation, like governance and national security. And what we need now more than ever is a continued human-led approach to designing these systems, and we need global collaboration on AI. Few people sit closer to the inside view of all these things than Chris Lehane. He is the Chief Global Affairs Officer at OpenAI. He's a former senior White House advisor, serving in various positions in the administration of President Bill Clinton. He has rather a lengthy CV, so if you want to know more after this session, perhaps you can go ask ChatGPT. Chris is joining Chris today is the technology editor at the Australian Financial Review, Paul Smith. He has been covering the tech sector and the innovation sector for more than 20 years, and it is great to have him here today to steer this conversation. Would you please welcome to the stage Chris Lehane and Paul Smith?
I think if we kick off, just to give some of the context, Caroline gave a bit of a background to your professional past, worked with Al Gore, part of the Clinton administration, then via Airbnb. Can you sort of fill in how that move from the political world to the tech world has played out and how you've seen it change?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before jumping in, first of all, thank you all for having me. I think it's really cool to see, I think this is the third South by Southwest here in Australia, and I think Australia was the first country outside of the US to convene South by Southwest. I think that really speaks to the strength of the tech community, developer community here. And this is one of my favorite countries in the world to visit. I got off a flight this morning at 7:30 a.m., got my flat white, got a brekkie in, it was awesome. Did an incredible run along the waterfront down to the Opera House. So, and I don't just say this, I showed Paul this earlier. My screensaver with my two boys. This is from 2017 on Bondi Beach, and it's still my screensaver. So I always love being here. And Paul, thank you for doing this.
That's so good.
I'm not only in the hands of a professional, I'm with someone who really does lead the conversation here in Australia, and someone not only known in Australia, but really around the world for your knowledge and insights on tech. So a little bit of a backstory on this. So you mentioned I come out of politics originally when I had a lot more hair. I was a senior advisor in the Clinton White House, and in the second term, I worked for Al Gore. And Gore at the time was the point person in the Clinton White House on what was then known as the information superhighway, or the World Wide Web. And one of the things that he would do on virtually a monthly basis is he would meet with these tech executives, but no one knew them as tech executives. No one knew them as tech bros, definitely. And they would come to the White House, and I got the chance to just sit in these meetings. And I literally felt like I was in these meetings thinking about and hearing what the future was going to look like long before the rest of the world really was getting visibility and knowledge. And so after the 2000 election, and this is obviously a little bit of a younger crowd, you probably weren't all focusing on the 2000 presidential election, but it was quite controversial in the US. So the way I look at it is Al Gore was not sworn in. He actually won, he just wasn't sworn in. But after that, I moved out to California, really as a function of having sat in all of those meetings and really coming to the conclusion that we were at the front end of entering into an entirely new socioeconomic age, on par with ag age into industrial age. And at that time, and even to this day, the epicenter of it was going to be in Northern California. And so I moved out to San Francisco and originally began representing early tech companies. I mean, to put this in perspective, I did sessions in DC where I explained to people what a BlackBerry was. Yeah. Remember that? Like, I was an original beta tester of the BlackBerry. I remember showing people what an Apple phone was. I remember one presentation in particular showing people how you could call a car than an Uber on your phone, and people being completely blown away by this. And so I sort of began as a translator between the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C., and governments around the world. But then as technology expanded, it began to have much more of what I'd call an impact in the real world. So you then got the sharing economy, right around 2008, 2009, a variety of factors came into play. And technology companies at that time then had to actually begin to figure out how they were going to deal with regulations and public policy. That took you through ride sharing, Airbnb, food delivery, all of that, right? So you had technology that was initially in the software, really beginning to impact the physical world. And now you're entering, the age of what Sam Altman, our CEO, co-founder, calls the age of intelligence. And I do think that this is something that is really genuinely going to be akin to ag age, to industrial age. And so there's a really long-winded way of saying I got into politics originally because I thought it was a place you could really make a difference. I come from a working class background and fundamentally believe that you always need to be expanding the economic pie and making sure that working people, middle class people actually get the biggest knife possible to get the biggest slice of that expanding economic pie. It drew me to the tech sector to really be a voice for that. And I think with AI, which is fundamentally a general purpose technology, and we can get into what that means, but broadly speaking, it's a productivity driving technology. And I'm really motivated, and our company is, by ensuring that as many people as possible can participate in that.
Can I ask, obviously, you mentioned that you were on the Al Gore side of the political aisle. What did you learn in that time that you've been able to use since now? Because, I mean, you must have learned some lessons about how power and influence works in Washington, particularly when you're dealing with a president from the other side of the political aisle.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think fundamentally, I think the biggest lesson I took from that time period, and in particular working with both Clinton and Gore, is that you can build your values into technology. I think sometimes there's this idea that technology is neutral. And at some level, the basic level, there is a truism to that. But there's also a fundamental truism that, particularly in democratic societies, small d democratic societies, we as democracies can make choices that will inform how that technology actually lands in the real world, how it impacts everyday people. Now, sort of at the practitioner level, which is maybe where you were sort of pointing that question, I do think it's really important that when you do policy, that you do a couple things. I think first and foremost, that you actually have a conversation out there where you're really, we call it first to truth, like having a real genuine conversation about what the social value proposition of a particular technology, in this case, an entire space, is going to be, because that conversation then implicates a discussion about those values. I think secondly, you have to actually really involve people in that. And then third, I think there's a huge burden and responsibility to get the technology right, but also to bring it down so folks can actually understand what it's going to mean in their lives, so that they have a chance to have a say on it.
Was there a moment for you then,
Yeah.
sort of like the oh wow moment, where you thought, well, you've been at Airbnb, which was obviously transformative in its own niche, but we're on a different level with
Yeah.
AI. What was the moment that you thought, well, geez, this is the area I want to make the rest of my career in?
Yeah, I mean, I was at Airbnb up through about 2022, and then after the company went public, moved into doing investing in the Valley. And quick, sort of context on AI. AI has been around, depending on how you want to count, 45, 50 years. But there hadn't really been, other than the abstract concept of it, a real breakthrough on it. What happened with OpenAI is in 2015, it was sort of kicked off, and I'm going to answer your question specifically, but
Sure.
There's a little context here. It was kicked off by a small group of researchers. It was almost like a science project. And they made this bet that they could do something called deep learning. And at the most simplistic level, that's this idea that you could design algorithms that would replicate how the human brain thinks, learns, processes information. And it was a fairly controversial bet at the time. I think the conventional wisdom in AI at that point was that was not the path to pursue. And then beginning, late 2017, 2018, it became really clear that that was the right bet, that they had made a real breakthrough. And I had had the chance to get to know some of the people who were involved. So I'd been following it all along, but I think like probably many in this room, it really wasn't until ChatGPT emerged, which was November of 2022. And overnight, I mean, it was on par with, I think, one of those singular moments where there's a before and there's an after. I think I was just incredibly lucky to have a little bit of pattern recognition, maybe because I was older and had been through a couple of these. And to me, I had seen different iterations of the technology revolution, but this was the big thing. This was, going, as I said earlier, from one age to the other. And at that point, I decided that this is something that I really wanted to be involved with. I had, the privilege of having gotten to know Sam a little bit over the years, Sam Altman, and a number of the leaders. And, I had the privilege of being able to come in, and I do think about it as an incredible privilege. I get to be part of something that's really special every day with a really special group of folks.
Well, you do. You've got an inside view on things that people like me and people that, in any area for creativity, science fiction, are wondering, okay, where is this going next? So where would you, if we take the concept of AGI, artificial general intelligence, that's kind of been the goal that the companies like OpenAI are racing towards. If you can just sort of expand a little bit on what that means and where you think we're up to. Is it a marathon? Are we halfway through?
This is a great question. There's a lot to unpack on that. So first of all, I used the word general purpose technology. That's actually what GPT stands for. And again, this is a pretty sophisticated crowd, so I think a lot of you know this, but a general purpose technology is something like the wheel, the steam engine, the printing press, electricity, transistors, right? It's effectively an infrastructure technology for the economy. And so this is what, at a baseline, what AI is. What AGI is basically when you get AI to a level where across virtually every function that a human can do, it performs at, if not well above, what the most sophisticated human can do in that particular category. There's something that comes beyond that, which is super intelligence. And I do think it's important to sort of define and distinguish those two things. In many respects, AGI, in some different ways already exists today, a little bit in the background. And I think we'll sort of evolve into that, whether it's 1 year or 5 years, I don't know. But sometime in the relatively near future. But I don't think it's going to be one of those things like a light switch goes on and off, and one day the world's this, and then the next day the world's completely different.
Think it's suddenly going to wake up.
Yeah, you're sort of right. It'll just sort of become the background noise, and maybe an analogy here is transistors and Moore's law, right? Transistors, for a long time were doubling. This is the whole Moore's law, with the price point coming down. So Moore's law meaning Wright's law. But everyday life wasn't changing, it just sort of changed over time. Phones became smaller, TVs became better, electronics became better. I think AGI will be a version of that. Superintelligence is when you get systems that are going to be able to perform at an incredibly high levels. One version of that is they actually can then become recursive. They can start to think on their own, work on their own. This is the world where potentially you have agents that can actually run things, run large organizations. What we try to do is think about it a little bit more in what I would call prosaic terms of the next couple of years. We do think we're in the sort of front end of the agentic time period, right, where you're going to start to see these agents. People are building them and working with them already. If you're using customer service from a variety of places right now, that's a version of agentic AI. I think over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to start to see the significant impacts in science and healthcare, where the scientific research and analysis that you're going to be able to do is potentially going to start to lead to some really interesting breakthroughs. And then after that is probably a time period where you start to get more of the robotics in the physical real world. I think, to me, what's most interesting about your question is what I broadly define as the societal adaptation or adoption of all of this. And I do think one of the huge questions that all of us face, and certainly at some level is what wakes me up every night at 3 a.m. I generally go back to sleep, but it does wake me up, which is, do these changes take place in 5 years, or do they take place over 20 years? 20 years, by any historical analysis, is a pretty short time period. But in terms of our ability as a society to think about this stuff and process it, 5 versus 20 is a pretty big distinction. But I do think that that's going to be a really, if I'm a betting person, I think this is going to be more on the smaller end, the quicker end, than the longer end. Although what history would tell you is that generally technologies the innovations happening and then really being adopted tend to take a little bit longer.
I think one thing that would be clear, I get the point about AGI not necessarily waking up one moment and suddenly being switched on, but there is clearly a sense, certainly for people observing from outside, that there is a race towards something. One of the first announcements from the Oval Office after Trump was sworn in was this Stargate initiative, $500 billion to build out data center infrastructure. What does that tell us about how desperately the US wants to beat China in an AI arms race, and what are you racing towards if there's not this one moment?
Well, I think, so when I talk about waking up at 3 a.m., the three things that I wake up on, and they're all inherently interrelated. One I've already touched on a bit, which is this is a productivity-driving technology. Is it democratized, or is it concentrated in the hands of the few? If done well and done right and informed by the values that I'm guessing most of the people in this room share, it can be democratized and have an incredible impact on folks because it will expand the economic pie. Two is the geopolitics that you were referring to. The reality is that there are two countries in the world that can build frontier models at scale. One is the US and the other is the People's Republic of China. We don't necessarily think about this as a fight as much as it is a competition, but it is a very real competition, and the stakes are pretty significant. US-led frontier models will inherently be built on democratic values, democratic rails. PRC will probably be built on autocratic rails. And so, you think of a world built at one point on US dollars, right? That was built on democratic financial rails, and there is a version of that as you get into the AI age. You can't democratize this, and you can't have democratic rails built out unless you have infrastructure. I think this is, by the way, very relevant in Australia at the Australia level, but I'll talk about this from the US perspective per your question. Infrastructure is destiny because electrons translate into intelligence. And what the infrastructure of the AI age is, it's made up of the following. It's chips, it's data, it's energy, and it's talent. And whichever country is more effective at marshaling those resources to maintain the competitive lead, right now the US does have that lead, it's not insurmountable, is going to be the country that does determine whether the world is built on democratic AI or autocratic AI. And as I noted, it's a very real competition. China has said that they want to be the dominant player by 2030. Vlad Putin, who I typically would not quote, but on this, I think he had a pretty interesting observation, which is whoever wins that competition wins the world. And so for us, the Stargate project that you referenced, was and is an effort by us to make sure that we can develop the infrastructure that's going to be needed so that we can maintain the democratic lead on this. And by the way, $500 billion sounds like a lot. As of 2 weeks ago, we announced that we were more than halfway to that. We released a study recently that showed that China put on over 400 gigawatts of energy onto the grid last year, which is an enormous amount of energy, and that for the US to match that. When I say the US, I also think about this as US and its allies are going to need to start to generate about 1 gigawatt of energy on a weekly basis. I do think Australia has the potential to play a really important role in all of this. They'll be super relevant to Australia from an economic perspective, but also in this larger democratic conversation.
So what does winning the AI race look like then? If whichever country wins the race wins the world. If we're not racing towards a moment where AI suddenly wakes up and can do way more powerful things than anyone else, what does winning actually look like? And are you confident your side will win?
Well, I think I'd say broadly our side. If I could be ecumenical. This is a Five Eyes nation. Look, I think that when, in a perfect world, in an ideal world, you could see in the same way that there have been superpowers, and those superpowers, more or less accommodate each other. I also think that the nature of this technology, particularly not just the AGI piece, but the superintelligence piece, will likely mean, or at least potentially mean, that one of the two will end up being the player that the rest of the world builds on. So one of the things that we have really focused on as a company is something called OAI for countries. And that is taking the Stargate example that you talked about earlier, which is infrastructure in the US, and seeking to work with countries around the world so that those countries can begin to stand up their own AI infrastructure, so that an Australia could have sovereign AI of its own, a UK could have sovereign AI of its own, a Germany could have sovereign AI of its own, and Argentina, Canada. These are all places that I have been to or our company's been to in the last 4 or 5 weeks where we've made some forms of an announcement where we're going to work with those countries to help stand up sovereign AI. And that is an extension and advancement of this idea of, can we collectively build out that democratic AI? And look at obviously I referenced earlier, there are 2 countries in the world that can do this at scale. I think for the US to be most effective at this, we do need to think about the world in the sense of what's the serviceable, available democratic market out there, and work with as many countries as possible so that we're collectively building out democratic AI. And if we do that, like I do think the punchline on this is not just the pure geopolitics as one country superior to the other. I think it really comes down to the everyday people. Are everyday people going to be able to participate in this? I mean, if you think about this technology, it gives people the ability to think, to learn, to create, to build, and to produce as individuals, right? And that's what democratic AI will actually optimize for. If it's autocratic AI, it will not necessarily be optimizing for creating opportunity on the economic side, freedoms on the individual side, down at that level. And so I do think when it comes to whether people are going to be able to participate in this and benefit from it in the way that it's, that it's potentially available, that is a very, very big question, and an incredibly important question that we as a world get right.
Yeah, no, we've already got some really interesting questions coming through
sure.
on the iPad, so I'll ask one of those and combine it a little bit.
Yeah.
So thank you for the questions coming in. Please keep them coming because it's some great ideas in there. The first one here is that I was going to ask is, well, we had someone at South by Southwest called Main Code demonstrating their local large language model yesterday. But really, at the moment, no one in Australia has built an LLM of significant size. Why do you think that would be, and do you think sort of local sovereign AI models are a viable proposition going forward?
So this is a question that almost every country, asks. I mentioned earlier that there are 2 countries right now that can really build frontier models, LLM models, at scale. And the reason for that is just the amount of resources, right? We talked about the critical elements, the data, the energy, the chips, the talent. The ability to access those tend to be very limited and extraordinarily expensive. But I did say that I believe Australia, occupies a really unique position. This is a country, if you look at our underlying data, and I'll just share some stuff. Our growth in this country in terms of a user base is about 2.5x year over year. I'm doing these numbers off the top of my head, so if I get them slightly off, but I think these are directionally accurate. I think we have around, in the neighborhood of 10 million people who use chat in Australia. I think the population here, correct me if I'm wrong, is about 25 million, is that right? So, that's roughly, a third, maybe half of all adults who are using it. We have more than 30,000 developers who are building here. If you look at it on a per capita basis, from the developer perspective, from the user perspective, this is a top 10 nation in the world. So this is an AI forward place. I think that builds on the technology hub that already exists here. You have 35 unicorns that exist in Australia. We work with some incredible companies, Canva, Atlassian, and so you have like this base here that puts you in a really unique position, a ton of talent. You also have access to energy. You have one of the biggest, fastest growing sort of renewable energy sectors. Obviously have traditional energy sources here. And you also have fiber optics to go out to the rest of Asia. And as I mentioned earlier, are a Five Eyes nation. And so if you look at those basic facts, you can see a world where if the Australian government and private sector wanted to create infrastructure here that could stand up a frontier model, that's possible. Now, I think it's probably very difficult to have one that would be solely Australian. It would probably have to be in partnership with one of the big frontier models. But you could create a version here where you have a frontier model and then you create a very specific Australian one that is, Australian sovereign AI, language, customs, culture, really built into it. And then Australia almost gets the best of both worlds. One, it has a model that actually really serves the really robust ecosystem that is here, but then it also becomes an exporter of AI. And so you get the productivity benefits domestically, and then you also are leveraging some of your inherent resources to become a real center of it. And this is one of the few countries in the world that US government will probably be pretty comfortable working with. I mean, I know there's a lot going on between the different countries today. Maybe an understatement. I think there's even a meeting on Monday in Washington, if I'm tracking correctly, right? But what we've seen around the world is that AI actually ends up being an interesting framework or pathway for countries to work with the US government. It doesn't have any of the pre-existing sort of narrative or issues that are associated with other aspects of trade, and whether it's UK, Germany, Canada, all these countries, I think, have been looking at ways to be able to work with the US, via AI as a potential place where you can find real common ground, where, this is not, social media, right? It's not an extractive technology. It's actually a productive driving technology. And so it transcends a lot of the fault lines.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
So if you stand up AI, if a US company, say it's OpenAI, and look at part of the reason I am here is to have these very conversations. I'm having conversations, as you know, you and I talked a little bit about this with government officials and private sector folks. Like, we as a company are really committed to trying to stand up, an AI infrastructure here in Australia. It obviously needs to be led by Australians. I'm here to listen and to learn, but our commitment, assuming that folks do want to work with us, is to be able to do that here. But what I really mean by productive is if you have sovereign AI of, for, and by Australia, Australia stands up an inference model in Australia, that's going to be used to drive productivity. I mentioned you have 30,000 developers working on AI. Those are the companies of the future, the small businesses of the future, the revenue and jobs of the future. This is a country where I think this technology in particular will allow the economy to really diversify. As I understand it, and again, you covered this, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, a fairly status quo GDP, right around 1.8, I think, GDP annually. US is a little bit around 3 historically. This technology, because it does drive productivity benefits and productivity gains, can be really useful to small countries that have enormous talent to be able to grow their productivity domestically, but also then to become, to use it from an export perspective. And so it's not like social media. There's all different perspectives on social media. I try to be a little bit balanced, some really good benefits in terms of information flows, obviously some issues, in terms of what it has done for society. But for countries, right, US social media companies came in, they extracted enormous amount of value. Countries didn't necessarily get the benefits of those economics on the ground in their country. This technology is going to drive productivity on the ground in Australia for Australians. And that's particularly the case if Australia is able to stand up an inference model that really does work for Australia.
Now, I'll come back to some of the issues around the sort of financial questions that people have around the development of AI. But one thing I wanted to ask as well, along the lines we were just discussing, you've got a really interesting job in that you're head of global affairs for OpenAI. You're dealing with governments and public policy people and working out what we should be doing, what can be done. It seems to me, observing, that the conversation a year and a half, 2 years ago was about safety and ethics and setting the right framework, and now it's shifted to winning. Which countries are going to get there first? It doesn't strike me that the ethics questions have been resolved. What do you put the shift down to? Is it just having a more, I guess, for want of a better word, aggressive president in the White House, or are there other things at play here?
I think there's a couple of dynamics at play. I think, first of all, the companies that are really doing the frontier models, which is where I think a lot of the focus on the risk have demonstrated that they are doing this in a responsible way. I mean, I can speak for OpenAI, right? We have partnerships with the US Safety Institute, with the UK Safety Institute. We're the first non-European company to sign on to the European Code of Practice. And what all of those have in common is that they're beginning to develop a consistency in terms of what companies report, what companies share. The simple version of it is that we do a model run, we then test it for things that would represent catastrophic risks in a variety of areas. We then mitigate, we then share it with those governments to be able to run their own tests. And I think you've begun to see sort of the leading frontier models do some version of that. So there's been a commonality of the industry itself working with governments to demonstrate that they're doing this in a safe and responsible way. So I think that's first and foremost, that's been demonstrated. Secondly, I think as people become more cognizant of this, there is a growing understanding of what we've been talking about here, which is that this is a productivity-driving technology. It is nation-building technology. Like, it is the equivalent of electricity in the 1920s. Your country is going to need this to be able to succeed. You think about the first couple big safety summits that took place at Bletchley Park were called the AI Safety Summit Seoul, AI Safety Summit. The one in Paris was called the AI Action Summit. The one in India is going to be called the AI Action Summit. And I think that reflects the fact that countries, as they become more knowledgeable about this, recognize that it is a productivity-driving technology and that they need to be thinking about it in terms of what the economic opportunity is. And then I think the third piece is, here today, OpenAI has more than 800 million folks who use it on a regular basis. We have 3.5 billion chats that take place a day. I think 35,000 chats a second, if I'm doing my math right. There's an enormous number of people. More than 800, and that's close to like 1 in 10 of the world population. And so I think what is happening is that as more and more people use it, right, there is more and more of a growing comfort level with it. I always tend to think about this as 3 poles in the ground. There is the pace of the innovation, and that's if that's accelerating. Like, all the scaling laws of AI are holding, and the most simplistic way to think about it is the more resources, i.e. the more compute you put into it, the faster the technology accelerates. But not too far behind that is what I would sort of broadly call user adoption. Like, everyday people, small businesses, big businesses are using this and using it really as a way to help them gain those productivity benefits. And then there's a third pole, and this is probably the one that trails the most, and this would be sort of broader societal adoption, and that's typically government. So you get those first two that are sort of moving in parallel, and government, I think, lagging a bit. And so a lot of the work I do is trying to sort of bring those things more into confluence. But I think the bigger piece here is all 3 of those things have taken place, right? Users at a pretty big scale, governments recognizing the opportunity, and companies demonstrating that they're doing this in a responsible way.
Now, you mentioned before about the social media companies being more extractive than AI. I think one area where there's probably quite a few creative professionals in the room that would feel that AI and OpenAI is extractive is in the copyright area. The most popular question currently on the slide out here is copyright theft is AI's original sin. How willing is OpenAI to do deals with publishers, and I would add other creatives, and what's stopping you doing more deals with Aussie publishers? At the risk of sounding self-interested as a journalist, I would expect... I
think you're going to make a deal with me right here on the
spot. That's right. You'd have me on toast. What's your take on it?
It's a great question, and an incredibly important question. OpenAI has done more deals with more publishers than any of the AI companies out there. But I think when you get to the copyright issue, it comes back to, I think, a point I was trying to make earlier, which is when you think about technology and values, right? There's often competing values that you're trying to balance, equities that you're thinking about, and ultimately that does need, particularly in democratic societies, does need to be handled and addressed through the democratic process. And what we've experienced and what we've seen, in countries around the world, and I'm often in these rooms and traveling, and this is an issue that comes up almost everywhere. I would broadly say that there are sort of 2 different directions that countries have gone in. There are countries that either really want to have a frontier model there, or want to do frontier model training so that they can really be a leader in terms of having AI ecosystems in their countries, build up the infrastructure that's required. Earlier, I mentioned that data is one of those key components. And those countries are making the decision to pursue copyright in ways similar to the US, where we have something called fair use, which allows the ability of companies to do training on publicly available. That there are other countries in the world that are making decisions where they want to either maintain their historic approach to copyright or potentially even be more restrictive on that, and that's totally up to them. In those countries, they are then making the choice that they are not necessarily going to be able to have the type of big, robust AI ecosystem that they maybe want, but that's a decision that's totally up to them. From our perspective, we will engage in either country. Like, we will find ways to work with those who want to build up the big frontier models and have robust ecosystems, or those who just want to have much more narrowly defined AI. So it's ultimately going to be up to countries to make these decisions. And the final point I'll just make on this is, look, the copyright is clearly a really hard issue, and enormous respect for creators. And I tend to be an optimist on this, not surprising given the chair and the seat I am in. I do think ultimately this is a democratizing technology. I think we need to figure out the ways to make sure that creators are really benefiting and participating in that. We are actively having all sorts of conversations on that front. Like, this is the early innings of a much longer, I'm using the baseball analogy, I'm not sure what the cricket version of that would be. Cricket's been like 5 days here. I remember when I came to one of these. So this is like day one of a cricket match, right? And I do think that this is something that we are going to work on really trying to figure out.
I don't wish to sort of put words into your mouth.
Sure.
Can I just clarify? Are you saying that if Australia doesn't loosen its copyright laws to fair use, that this kind of Stargate-type investments aren't going to be made in Australia?
No, first of all, as I said, we are going to be in Australia one way or the other. I mean, I think, maybe look at a place like you've seen some of the European countries where, they potentially want to continue to pursue how they've historically looked at copyright. They are effectively foregoing frontier, but they still can get an inference model in their country, right? It's not a binary, we're going to continue with our copyright or, apply a more restrictive copyright and we don't get AI. It is, we're going to pursue that, but you probably end up with more of an inference model that limits ultimately what you can do, but you're still going to benefit from AI. And so our perspective is countries should make that decision. We will work with them under either scenario, regardless of which decision that they make, and we will work with them to make sure that they have a successful approach.
Now, on this creative side, I'm not sure, I'm sure most people or a lot of people in the audience will be familiar with Sora 2.
Sora 2.
Sora 2 that's come out. For people that are not, can you sort of give us a little rundown on why it's been so revolutionary? Because obviously in the US and Canada, it's been even faster in terms of uptake than ChatGPT.
Yep.
Can you just give a thought about?
Yeah, because Sora was not released here in Australia. In fact, for some of the reasons that we talked about.
Copyright.
Right. And so that's sort of an example of like what the distinction that sometimes happens in these. So what Sora 2 is, it's a technology that allows you to create 10-second videos. You literally can go on your Sora app. You can type in, or you can talk in, whichever version you want, a couple sentences of a video that you would like to see. And it takes anywhere from 30 seconds to 60 seconds to produce an incredibly high quality video. I'm someone who at one point in my life tried to pretend like I could be on TikTok, and I found it took me hours to produce something that was not very good. I actually do a pretty decent job with Sora. I was actually, and I won't name the person, though if you go look at some of my LinkedIns, you could figure it out. I was with a head of state recently in their office, and we jointly made a Sora video about infrastructure in their country to get right there in the president's office. It's a really cool thing. And so I look at Sora, and this relates, I think, a lot to your copyright question. If you're a creator and you're using social media as your distribution channel, or you're using whatever distribution outlets, this is a technology that's going to allow an individual creator to be able to produce incredible content and then figure out ways to distribute it and monetize it without necessarily having to go through some of the third parties that would extract some of their creative talent. I think Sora is going to be a particular area where, as we look forward, I think you're going to find really interesting ways that we will be able to align interests with creators. I think for a normal person, it's incredibly fun. I mean, I think that's, at the end of the day, people are really enjoying this. They're really having fun with it because you can actually go and really just play with it.
Yeah, look, it's undoubtedly great fun. I mean, there's lots of memes. I mean, the things I've seen, like people creating things with Super Mario, Pokemon, but should we be allowed to? I guess that's the question that I'm trying to get to the nub of there. I was reading an article, it was a Japanese government minister making a formal request to OpenAI to stop letting people recreate well-known anime and manga characters because they describe them as irreplaceable treasures. What's your response to this? Because clearly the system has been trained on those before having permission.
Yeah, I know. Initially, we sort of had this, opt-out, and then, evolved it into an opt-in, which makes it a more straightforward approach. Yeah. Again, this is, I think, one of those areas where you're going to have to figure out, how you can work as well as possible with those creators. There's a lot of creators who have their content now being distributed in ways that they never ever were distributed before. There were a couple of very prominent folks when we did Imogen, which was an earlier version. That was just images, not video. That suddenly found that they were getting enormous brand and distribution benefit, from the size of our platform and ability for people to be able to create these images. As I said earlier, I'm relatively confident, again, optimistic. I try to be an optimist / realist, but I do think in the video and content area like this, it's going to be a natural place to figure out ways to make sure that we're able to work with creators to create value for everyone. Remember, we've only deployed Sora in a very limited way. I mean, one of the things, just for everyone to understand, we typically do something called iterative deployment. And that means we do this stuff in stages where we do it internally with our employees, then we expand to a smaller group. So for Sora, you had to be on a very sort of restricted list. A limited number of people were able to do it. From there, you'll continue to expand almost in concentric circles. And the reason we do that iterative deployment is so that we can learn some of this stuff and then be able to build those learnings in with a feedback loop before it's broadly deployed around the world. Yeah,
but in terms of, to sort of push back a little
Sure.
bit there, you've clearly launched this and to subscribers and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Before this issue of copyright is figured out, should you have not done it the other way around, figured out whether you should be paying for people before you started monetizing it?
Yeah, look, I think this is the nature of how technology works. I mean, it's funny, remind me of the story when electricity first came out. Who opposed electricity the most initially? And this, was originally designed in the US. It was the early fossil fuel companies. Right? The fossil fuel companies opposed it because they were concerned it was going to put the lamps that were lit by fossil fuels in cities at that time, out of business. What ended up happening with electricity is it actually allowed the automobile to be built. Those industries actually expanded enormously as a result, other consequences of that. But I think if you just look at the long arc of history and how technology works, right? Innovations come along, and then societies adapt to those innovations. I think for this technology, and this comes back to a point we were talking about earlier, in what time horizon does this take place, and are we able to adapt quickly enough so that we're really making sure that you're democratizing the benefits? One thing to keep in mind with OpenAI that I think is an important point, at least I think is an important point in all of this, is, and particularly on the data piece, is we have those 800 million regular users. Remember, we give everything away for free. Like the vast majority of the people who are using OpenAI to help with learning and thinking and creating and building, who are learning it, who are using it in their schools, who are using it to improve their healthcare, are using it for free. We are a nonprofit, and our purpose is to build AI that benefits everyone. And in the same way that a couple generations ago, people could go to the library and learn, people are using OpenAI in a very similar way, but with really powerful technology that's really built for this day and age. And so I keep coming back to the point, which is democratic values need to get built into this. But if you do build them in, this is an incredibly empowering technology for just normal, everyday people. It is inherently democratizing technology. There's the Archimedes line, which is that in the physical world, he used to talk about this idea that if you gave an individual a big enough lever, that individual, based on mathematical principles, could literally move the world, right? The lever would have to be way, 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 way far into space. But this is the equivalent of that for the human brain. And it should be available and accessible to everyone. so that everyone has a chance to get access to this and to be able to use their brain in ways that can become more and more powerful.
Yeah, the copyright one's obviously an issue that's going to go bubbling on, but I've got a countdown clock in front of me.
I was excited to do our deal right here.
I am not authorized.
Well, see, if you are using the technology, you could have your own publication,
That's right.
you'd be empowered, you'd be doing.
And I'd probably be very poor. In terms of one of the other sort of real, I guess you'd call it kitchen table issues, people talking around the around the dinner table, would be the sort of the split between this idea of improved productivity and people going, have I still got a job in the future? Particularly, I guess, we've talked creative, but also in the sort of low to middle level white collar work. I interviewed Sam Altman earlier this year, and he seemed like he was still thinking on this issue, what the long-term implications were, and seemed to favor the idea of some kind of universal business income for people if there's going to be displacement of jobs. What's your take on it, and what's your take on how the employment market is going to change in the near and longer term?
Yeah, this is so important to get right. Not to be Pollyannish, but again, if you look at technology and history, technologies typically end up creating more new jobs than jobs that they eliminate or displace. I mean, there's more jobs that exist today that did not exist before World War II. That's really easy to say, like charts, graphs, data, right? It's abstract and it's antiseptic. At the end of the day, if you're someone whose job is going to get displaced, that doesn't really matter, right? And I do think it's really incumbent upon companies like ours, the public sector, to begin to think about what are the real solutions going to be on this. We've done a couple of things over the last couple months to begin to take steps in those directions. First of all, we do put out a lot of data to show people what we know and what we're learning. We have something called a GDP eval, which literally on a sort of ongoing basis shares what we are seeing out there, and we have more data than anyone else in the world right now. We've also announced that we're creating something called the marketplace, and what the marketplace is going to do is basically be a broadly available AI training and certification program. So companies and businesses will be able to use it, for a modest cost to be able to train and upskill their employees. We're going to work with the public sector and make it free and available, and also just the broader public, with the idea being that AI literacy is going to be, a basic requirement for folks to be able to succeed in the AI and intelligence age. And so the third piece, which I've talked about already, is making sure we're trying to get this into as many people's hands as possible, right? It's great that it's free. You also need to know how to use it and benefit from it. The final piece of the marketplace will be to, after we do the training and the certification, to try to match people up for the jobs that are being created or developed. So the idea here is start to see where the technology is creating new jobs, use our training capacity, combined with our visibility on this, to begin to upskill and train folks for where those new jobs are going to be. But that's scratching the surface, right?
I've almost lost count of the number of people working for technology companies that will have said to me, AI is not going to replace you, but someone using AI might do. Is that kind of like a comforting platitude? Do you really believe that we're going to navigate this without millions of people being left behind?
No, I think that people, to be clear, do I think there will be more jobs created than displaced? Yeah. Do I think that some people will be displaced? Yeah, and I think we as a society, we as private sector companies can't simply say that's just the cost of this technology, right? We actually do have to solve for it. Again, I've named some of the ways that we are thinking about it. I've also said that's just the beginning of how we are thinking about it. One of the things that we've posited is, should society start to think about this from almost a pre-distribution benefit or perspective? So as you can probably tell a little bit, I was a history major in college. I get to play a technologist in these conversations, but I tend to find some comfort in looking at history, or at least lessons. And in the US, when electricity came along, it really caused a huge change in society. At the time, US was a rural society, it then became urban. Folks moved from agriculture into industry, but in the US, and it's reflected in our politics to this day, large swaths of the country that were left behind. When Franklin Roosevelt came into power, he created something called the Rural Electrification Agency, which was supposed to get electricity in the rural areas. But still those disparities and inequities exist to this day. And if we think about the pace of AI compared to electricity, it's going to be much faster. And I think redistribution is going to be a challenging thing to do. I think we're going to really have to think about pre-distribution. I think we're going to have to start to think about rights. Over the course of the industrial age, a whole bunch of rights were established. Rights to public education, some countries' right to healthcare, Social Security, right to contract, right to property. Those were all designed over time to try to ensure that capitalism was allowing the technologies of that era to be distributed in a more democratic way. I think we're going to have to start to think about what those rights are going to be, in the intelligence age. I do think that begins a little bit with, are you making sure that every single person actually has access to it? In the US, we have something called a minimum wage. You have versions of it here, right? In theory, it's supposed to be a wage scale to make sure that you can live a relatively decent life. How do we think about a version of that, in AI, in terms of giving people the ability to have access to this to then get the economic opportunities?
Now, we are running close to the end of our time together, and we've got lots of really interesting questions. I want to get through some of the other ones. So if they jump around a little bit in topic,
sure.
that's
This will be the hot topic ones.
Yeah, well, this one, the amount of energy required to win the AI race is massive. It's happening at the same time when the world's grappling with the existential risk of climate change. How do we do both?
Yeah, I mean, look, this country is really an interesting example, right? This place has been amongst the leaders in the world in doing the energy transition because of the imperatives of national security, geopolitics, economic competitiveness. There is no way you're going to be able to generate the amount of energy that is needed for this unless you modernize and make that transition. I did an awful lot in the US climate space in the prior part of my life. I think, this is going to be a catalyst for finally doing what a large part of the world, particularly the US, has not done yet, right? Which is to do that modernizing of our energy system. I do think nuclear is going to be a big part of this. And you're already seeing that conversation happening in the United States and other parts of the world. So again, the optimist in me see there's just no way you're going to, if the US is going to need 1 gigawatt of energy a week to be able to compete with what China is doing, you are going to have to modernize the sources of energy. China did 33 nukes last year. That's amongst the reasons they're able to generate so much energy. Like the US and other countries are going to need to be able to do stuff that's going to be on par with that.
Now, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here.
Sure.
First of all, having worked for Clinton and Gore, how do you square the circle with OpenAI's close relationship with the Trump administration? And also, to follow on from that, what makes you confident that a US-led tech product under the current regime is democratic and not autocratic in nature?
Yeah, so that's a good question.
I can't take credit for
Yes, so you were waiting for that one. So the way we engage with the government from sort of the partisan perspective is, we do have the leading AI technology in the world, at least as we see it here today, OpenAI. We really use our technology to engage and interact in the US with both political parties. We did a pretty unique event earlier in this year, after Trump was sworn in as president, his cabinet was in place. We did something called an AI economics event, where we came in and basically showcased and previewed where the technology was going, what our data showed, particularly conversations around the workplace that you were asking. And we invited representatives from both parties, and we had senators and members of Congress from both parties that attended, cabinet officials attended from the Trump administration, stakeholders representing the conventional left and right in the US. And it probably was one of the few events in the US that has taken place at that level that really had everyone in the room and really represented a diversity of perspectives in it. And so what we try to do is really anchor in on our technology and the values that we're pushing, and the values that we're advocating for, the democratizing of it, and the importance of building out that democratic AI. And for us, that means we work with both parties in terms of having those conversations.
And the second part, are you confident that America remains a democratic rather than autocratic?
Yeah, I am. I mean, look, I think I'm, as I said, a history major in college. I think that if you look at the arc of U.S. history, you go through periods. I think if you're living in the U.S., there is a significant portion of the country that really wanted to see a correction on issues that they were concerned about. That was the democratic process at work. And I do think that we're going through a broader socioeconomic transition. I think some of the stuff that is going on in our politics reflects that. And so, yeah, no, I am someone who strongly believes in the existence of U.S. democracy and the continued existence. And I think if you, again, you look at history, you have moments where you go this way and you go that way. But democracy, as others have said, tends to be a very messy process. But the U.S. has demonstrated over time that it gets this stuff right.
Yeah, to leave us with some hope, the founding principle of OpenAI was introduce AGI for the betterment and the advantage of all humans.
Yeah.
If you succeed, what does the world look like in 25 years' time?
I think in 25 years' time, you will see our education system globally is advanced incredibly. Every single kid in the world could have a tutor that complements their existing teachers. You will see healthcare, quality of healthcare improve dramatically. Think if you're in a country in the world where you don't have access to a doctor, you're going to have the ability to get really high quality healthcare. I'm pretty confident, if not very confident, you're going to get incredible scientific breakthroughs. Could it be in areas like dementia, Alzheimer's, cancer, the types of things that maybe 5 years ago people thought would have taken a miracle to be able to solve. More broadly, if you look at human history, productivity is absolutely critical to success. It's absolutely critical to a healthy and robust democracy, which was related to the prior question. This technology is going to drive productivity gains. I do think we'll get it right in terms of the democratizing of that. And I think you're going to end up with a world where there's going to be incredible abundance and incredible prosperity. John Maynard Keynes comes from the left. His view of the role of government was to ensure that as many people as possible were able to lead the good life. I think this technology, if imbued with the right values, is going to make it possible for more people than ever to be able to live a good life.
Well, we all hope you're right. Please join me in thanking Chris Lehane.
Thank you.